Welcome back to the Gunners Club, and you're here with Gunner, who's done a magic act and has actually split himself. So you're also here with Em, and of course in the middle with Seuss. How are you, gentlemen?
Howdy.
G'day, Eamon.
We were having a bit of a chat about science fiction and what's happening with science fiction today. I was really surprised and delighted the other day coming back from the cinema and seeing Dune 2. Now, you were a fan of it too, I think, weren't you, Eamon?
When's the last time people have been surveyed about their satisfaction? Would they recommend? Would they highly recommend? And 95% of the test audience says highly recommend. That's unheard of.
Well, I remember yourself, Eamon, coming out of a screening for The Phantom Menace, that terrible Star Wars prequel, and the cameras were geared up because they were trying to get some excitement in Melbourne. What do people think? What do people think? We need people who are red hot for this film. And you pulled an animated face, and what did you do?
1:30 in the morning, I came by and said, I expected to see the Phantom Menace, not Dennis the Menace.
So I take it they didn't use that as a promo for the film.
I picked up my Dennis the Menace popcorn bucket and walked away.
But Dune 2, I mean, it particularly appealed to me for a number of reasons. I think, firstly, a messianic story, which is what I think worked in Star Wars.
Whether he's a false messiah or not.
Well, if you've read the third book, or hopefully they're going to make the third film, it'll actually be the second book, The Messiah, you'll actually get to find out if he was or not. So we won't talk about that just now. Also, I think the special effects worked on a level of grandeur. I mean, who would have thought that seeing worms in sand dunes would be exciting? It was fantastic. I was elated.
Oh, they're enormous.
But it was good even in the original movie.
With the eyes
Well,
that you had of those
Which,
days.
Yeah.
which one are you referring to as the original movie? Are you talking about the 80s or the series that was done recently?
No, the full movie.
I didn't think that really worked for me. In fact, I found it was
Really?
a bit of an interminable bore.
Yeah.
I soldiered through the recent first Dune movie, bought it because, look, I thought I wanted to support something done with that budget and that grandeur. And it really paid off in the second film. I think it was a masterful film.
I would be very scared to live under a religious
Theocracy?
theocracy,
Yes.
such as what half of the planet was shown. And in fact, having the desert world, I think with red Mars, blue Mars, green Mars, it was much the same thing. Where
It was too, that's right. With the Arabic culture very heavily represented in that as well. So Dune is what I would classify as classic sci-fi. I mean, it was written, what, 60s?
yes,
Late 50s, 60s, and then progressed over the next couple of decades.
In
Star Wars as well, I would classify as that classic period.
probably in the same sort of time period as Asimov.
Yeah, now you're a big fan of George C. Clarke and Asimov.
Yes. Oh yeah. Well, they're the old original classics that I suppose I grew up with.
Yeah,
You know, I mean the Foundation series.
yes.
Which was just epic. Mm-hmm. It's a shame that they've never come out in movies, but I read the books, and I think I've read the books 3 times. I still got them there in hardcover inside. They ought to come out in movies.
they
over
can't,
that
they
thing.
can't, because every sterile science fiction that's come out since, your Star Trek or anything where inequality is no longer really a problem, the men and the women have become closer together. Whereas in Asimov, you always saw the inner life of the women, the love interests of the women, the young girls, and men were doing manly professions. There wasn't this like unisex life that all of the sterile science fictions are showing today.
That's interesting because I was the other side of the coin for the really old classics. I was reading Arthur C. Clarke as opposed to Asimov. And from memory, the women weren't really mentioned
Yeah.
at all. 2001, I mean, people talk about it as being the masterstroke of science fiction movies. I get it, and it was sort of made concurrently with the book being written. I went through and read all of the books in this series. They're fantastic. Eamon and Seuss, if you haven't seen them, read them, they're absolutely mind-blowing. For me, with what's coming out at the moment, I would say my top 3 fantasy science fiction movies would be, number 1 would be Arrival. Absolute masterful film. Masterful because it talked about trying to reconcile communication with aliens and how would you do that. So there's a bit of a backstory about human cultures and unification of human cultures, and then trying to decode a language system which is based not on a start and an end of thought, but a perfect symmetry of thought, where there's no start and end. It's just perfectly all occurring at the same time. I mean, it was perfectly represented by the palindrome of her daughter's name, Hannah,
yes,
whether,
yeah.
whether you read it from front to back or
But,
back to front,
and
it's the same.
they didn't come bearing useless gifts. They didn't come in order to put us under their debt one-handed. They knew that a reciprocity would be expected from mankind in time to come, which meant that there was some possibility for trust.
I would say number 2 for me would probably be Dune 2. I was really taken by it. I think a lot of the recent science fiction films that promised so much didn't deliver. The second Blade Runner film, I was lucky enough to see it at a cinema in Hawaii. I think that was a real letdown because we didn't really see what we expected as a future development of humanity there. But another film I'd say which I really particularly enjoyed for its camp fantasy was Flash Gordon. Absolutely adored it. And the world,
space fantasy. Sure.
yeah, sure. And they managed in the space of 90 minutes to
Hang
portray
on.
so many different worlds.
Hang on. Did you say Flash Gordon or Flesh Gordon?
I was torn between the two.
Yeah,
So
I was
sort
going
of sat
to
on the
say,
fence.
because I remember seeing Flash Gordon, and that didn't follow that storyline at all.
I thought it was a very heavy hitter. You can't go past District 9. The money was there, the cast was there to film a Halo film, which didn't happen.
What, was
And
that a South African film?
It was, and it was actually to show the effects of mass migration.
Yeah.
Just the idea that you had a class of an underclass that were first just shunted as unwanted dross, that were moored across what later became a concentration camp, and that they were listless, without leadership, dirty, poorly fed, and it's basically almost like a person who wants to go bankrupt in a casino. He loves the fantasy so much, he ultimately wants to say, I surrender myself unto your care.
What's tickled your fancy for science fiction movies?
I have to say, only because of my ancientness, would have to be the Star Treks.
Now, would you count Star Trek 1? Because everyone thinks of that movie, I'm talking about the movie, not the series, has been a great disappointment, but it was rescued by the Wrath of Khan.
Yes, it was. Look, I've liked the whole series as much as I like the whole series of movies, as much as I liked the TV series of.
Next Generation.
Yes.
Yeah, that really worked. It took them 3 seasons to actually get the characters to mesh.
Correct.
Then it really
and
worked.
then they brought out the offshoots from that, which I don't think really worked that well.
Well, look, for me,
Space
I
Nine, yeah.
really enjoyed the first season of Picard, which is a continuation, really, of the story of Jean-Luc.
Yep.
The second series was acceptable. The third series, people say, is where it redeems itself. I think it dropped the ball, and I stopped partway through the third series. But I tell you, when I was living in Germany, I was watching Star Trek The Next Generation.
Yep.
What it was called, Das nächste Jahrhundert, the next century it was called there. And it was as much gobbledygook in German and made-up language as it is in English, I can tell you. So sort of the magic is sort of gone there.
All science fictions concentrate on power, longevity, and what is wealth, because then you can talk about whether there's an equality or inequality. And I know that 10 years ago, the marketers of the world decided that the moniker for wealth would be hand in this world, that people would look for something that was handcrafted, handmade. But I don't think that's really going to be a stand for what technology is giving us now. I've done a lot of machine learning, and in the last 5 years, just before AI models came out, I found that refining the amount of resources or processes to get something done is where the economy has been made. So no one's really suddenly become wealthy that way, but the earth has grown a little bit less because of it. But now that it's possible to actually teach, for instance, a skill to a mouse, cut out that part of the brain and implant it to another, and that skill is actually passed across. A lot of things, like at a very basic level, skills can be passed across. Now that's a different when you look at skills, for instance, like muscle memory, which isn't just a neural stem memory, it's also with the muscles itself. So if I had a science fiction wanted to show wealth in the next 10 years, I would show men who are accentuating the masculinity through chemicals, hormones, and women who are enjoying their feminine self as well, because they're now wealthy enough to do it, to give themselves the cosmetic surgery and toning what they have. And the skill to actually be things like modern day gladiators, where it's opportunity and thinking three-dimensionally.
I'm thinking of wealth in recent movies like Blade Runner, where it was basically owning life, owning organic life, was really the portrayal of extreme wealth. If you had an owl in your office, you're extremely wealthy. Or things like Stargate, where you'd have almost Egyptian-style architecture and gold and costumes
Yeah, but it
and
goes
things
to
like
very,
that.
very sadistic ends. Like I read a book much like the China Doll, much like Blade Runner, where they'd actually get Nordic models of humans whose pores were so finely spaced together that they couldn't actually express heat, and so they were kept as pleasure dolls. And if a rich man would actually take her out for a night, he'd buy her a bath of ice, and that way it'd actually, take down her body temperature. So they're actually crafting a more dependent slave rather than actually trying to restore something like an extinct owl or an extinct snake, which we're doing in the
Okay.
Blade Runner films.
I'm just tailing back to when you said about expressions of wealth and the term of being done by hand. That really does go back as well to some of Philip K. Dick's early work and things like The Man in the High Castle, where in the book they were talking a lot about people who had curiosity shops who sold things before the Japanese occupation of America. And these trinkets suddenly were highly desirable, or things that were done by the Native Americans by hand as well. So it's interesting. For me, I would think that the, science fiction today is really going back closer to the classic science fiction than really going off forward, in that we're going back to talking about politics, we're talking about generational wealth, and we're talking about real high politics
but
as
The Man in
well.
the High Castle was actually written to show a quantum decision. It's like in some reality the Germans lost, and in some reality they actually won. Now, ultimately, his belief that it was some process in someone's brain that made a decision for it to happen. So even though you had curios and all that, he was actually forward thinking. It wasn't supposed to be old science fiction. It was supposed to be new science fiction that's set in that time.
You wonder how much he thought or how much he actually believed, because Philip K. Dick steadfastly believed that these alternate realities did happen and were happening. So they weren't actually, according to him, fiction he was writing. I'm actually reading a bit of Philip K. Dick at the moment, and yeah, he's a very curious cat.
So in effect, everybody in the world has read his work.
Thanks for joining us. We'd love to know what your thoughts are on science fiction, any of the good science fiction films out at the moment, and what you think the future of science fiction is.
And don't forget, the robots are rising. That's what Asimov said.
As it says in the Tabaret, in the end, the machines will win.
Isn't that the truth?
And it's written in Chinese and Vietnamese as well.
Well,
Believe it.
you got to cater to all sorts. Don't forget to like and subscribe, guys. We'll catch you on the next one.